Welcome to the External Medicine Podcast. My name is Daniel Belkin, and I'm here with my co-host and brother, Mitch Belkin.
We're both medical students interested in non-traditional ideas and innovation. This podcast is our attempt to explore topics currently on the outskirts of medicine, topics not widely accepted by the mainstream, but that we believe merit a closer look.
This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. We do not endorse any healthcare providers or treatments. Our views do not represent the views of any official organization or institution.
If you'd like to support us, follow us on Twitter at EXMedPod and sign up for our newsletter at externalmedicinepodcast.com/subscribe.
Today, we are interviewing Nikhil Krishnan. Nikhil is a prolific blogger and masterful meme maker who writes about the healthcare industry. He's the author of a free newsletter, outofpocket.health, where he tries to make the healthcare industry both more understandable and funnier. Previously, he worked at TrialSpark and CB Insights, and he is the author of a children's book called If You Give a Mouse Metformin, as well as a board game entitled Medical Bankruptcy Game.
In this conversation, we talk about his healthcare newsletter, why he's optimistic about healthcare startups, what he's learned from investing in health tech companies, as well as the healthcare intro course that he's currently building. We discuss pharmaceutical advertising to physicians, digital therapeutics, and unbundling of the hospital. We also briefly touch on medical education at the very end. We really enjoyed this conversation and hope that you do too.
And now we bring you Nikhil Krishnan.
Okay, we're here with Nikhil Krishnan. Nikhil, thank you so much for coming on the External Medicine Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Before we get started, do you have any financial disclosures?
Oh yeah. I think just before I do this, I think it's always funny because physicians in the medical community are very good about financial disclosures. And I think people in tech startup world just never disclose anything. So, digital health is the funny intersection for this. But yes, have financial disclosures. So I am a scout investor on behalf of a venture firm. And so I've made investments in a lot of different startups. I can list all of them out, but it's Axel Health, Neura Health, and lots of different other ones, Turquoise Health. And you can find all of them on my blog if you want to see, but lots of different startups. So, and I'll mention which ones I'm a financial investor in if I ever mention them in the interview.
Great. So to start off, can you just tell us a little bit about your background and then how you got interested in health tech?
Yeah, totally. So both of my parents are physicians, which they gave me the great advice of don't go into medicine. So sorry for everyone else listening. No, when I graduated from college, I joined a company called CB Insights. And so CB Insights kind of does market research on tech broadly, has a database of startups and a lot of their metrics and how they're performing. And so I joined as one of the first analysts and, was really actually forced to do a lot of different industries, sort of against my will. I did everything from construction, agriculture, chemicals, autonomous vehicles, healthcare, a lot of different industries, mile wide, kind of inch deep on all of them. And then as the team grew, we wanted to specialize a little bit on the different industries. And I actually picked healthcare. One, because I thought it was the hardest industry to get up to speed on of all of them. So I was kind of I think I can do a better job here than what's out there right now. And also there weren't that many people talking about the intersection of healthcare and software at the time. So sort of opportunistically thought I could carve out my niche there. And then also beyond that, I don't know, if you're interested in how financial incentives warp downstream behaviors, there's no better place than healthcare to watch this happen. It's this, super fucked up Rube Goldberg machine of you pull one financial lever here and just see what comes out the other end. So I always thought it was really interesting. And so I wanted to double down on healthcare, to the irony and hilarity of my parents later. But then, so after I was at CB Insights for about 4.5 years, went to a company called TrialSpark, which was turning private practices into clinical trial sites. And so working on the business development and partnerships team there. And then a little over 2 years ago, went to go start this stuff I'm doing at Out of Pocket. So for anyone that's kind of listening, the general gist is I'm trying to teach people how the business of healthcare works. And so that's through this newsletter I write. That is through some like shit posting novelty products, like a children's book about how clinical trials work and a card game where to avoid medical bankruptcy. Just like stuff that's, I don't know, really trapped in my like perturbed mind. And then the next phase is courses. So teaching kind of people a healthcare 101 course coming out soon, and then a few sub courses taught by experts coming out later. So that's the gist. I'm trying to make healthcare easier to understand for people, make it entertaining, trying to get new people into healthcare that are not in healthcare currently, and have people tackle the hard problems.
In terms of being at CB Insights and kind of getting a background for understanding metrics and analytics, and at the same time being able to be up to speed of what's going on in healthcare, what were the sorts of either problems that you work through or sources that you rely on to really try to understand what's going on in a whole industry, such that you're able to, in your newsletter Out of Pocket, like really synthesize it down and explain it to people in a way that is not only makes sense, but is like enjoyable and fun to read?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a couple of things. So I think one, I always try to get information from like people as sources rather than like industry magazines or articles or whatever. And that's why, that's why I spend a lot of time on Twitter and Reddit, because it's sort of people's firsthand accounts into a lot of different parts of healthcare. Like, sure, obviously, like from there, obviously we'll double check a lot of the stuff people say or find sources that kind of corroborate. But I find that getting data and information from people firsthand, one, just like makes researching more interesting, right? It's more personable than like reading blocks of text. But also beyond that, people's firsthand experiences are always going to tell a like much more raw, unfiltered story than a paper, article, or whatever ever will. And that sometimes is going to be more reflective and not get captured in metrics when you're trying to measure different things. So I try as much as possible to get my data from people who are doing stuff firsthand. When I was at CB Insights, we obviously did use a lot of data for things like benchmarking or trend analysis, et cetera. And we had a massive database of startups and their metrics to do that. We would work with a lot of third-party vendors also. And, you kind of build your chops just to like, I would say spending a lot of time in metrics is great for being able to build like a really good smell test kind of ability, where when you hear something, it's like, does that sound in the range of what I would expect on a lot of different metrics? And now investing is also like another way to do that. So investing in different startups and kind of like seeing the metrics that they encounter is a really good kind of like internal benchmarking mechanism for like when you see other startups and you're like, yeah, that doesn't sound quite right, because I've seen like now a million different pitches on X, and this is usually what they spend on Y or what kind of engagement they see. And so just building the smell test filter actually, I think, makes it easier to then find the sources that you can trust more, because like, okay, this person doesn't really seem to know what they're talking about, or this magazine like doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about these metrics, so can move on. So that's like a long-winded answer, but hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah. So what has it been like moving from these bigger companies to running your own company Out of Pocket? Like what has that experience been like, and what are some things that you've learned in the process?
It's funny because like your metric of bigger company and my metric of bigger company are probably very different. So for me, once like companies hit like 150 or 200 people, like that's too big for me. Whereas for I'm sure at people listening to this, that's like a pittance. That's like tiny. I love the like 0 to 1 phase of startup building. It's my favorite part of like, yeah, we're going to like go out, build a prototype and see if we can sell it to anybody. That's like my favorite phase of company. And also it's like the organization structure is way more flat. You kind of know all your coworkers, all that kind of stuff. So going from that to doing like a solo business, I think it's interesting, right? Like there's a lot of things that I miss that I did not realize I would miss, I guess, until later. So for example, feedback mechanisms. Like there's no like performance reviews. Like I can review myself. I'm going to give myself like an A+ every time. But there's no performance reviews when you're doing a one-person business, right? Or like celebrating wins or commiserating losses. Like some of my, best memories are being like, it's midnight at the office, I'm still here, and there's like 3 other people who are also, getting crushed by something, and we're all just like bitching and commiserating about like how much shit sucks. But that's how you get closer to people. So I do miss that. I think a lot of and I'm sure actually in for physicians it's like this too, but like a lot of your social fabric and identity comes from your job and like your coworkers and working alongside people that you can like brainstorm with and whatever. And being a one person shop, like you do sort of miss that a little bit. But at the same time, like being able to not take meetings I don't want to take is like sexually gratifying, honestly. It's one of the like best feelings in the world to have complete control of your entire schedule. I can like drop everything and go write a children's book if I want to, because there's no one like on my payroll that I have to like meet. It's just me being like, okay, well, I guess I'm doing this now. So that part is fun, I gotta say.
So you mentioned that you have kind of, I don't know if transition is the right word, but have moved towards investing more and more. What is it that you feel you've learned by being an investor in health tech startups that you weren't aware of prior to getting started in investing?
Yeah, totally. Just as a point of clarification, like I do invest on the side, but it's definitely not where I spend a lot of time. Like I'm still focused really on the newsletter and building the courses, etc. Investing is just nice because I've been helping health tech entrepreneurs for a long time, just sort of like altruistically, but it's nice to have some skin in the game and actually, work and build and be incentivized alongside them. I would say that my favorite part about health tech investing is just like how optimistic all the founders are. I think when you spend a lot of time in healthcare, it's really easy just to get very jaded after a while and just be like, everything sucks. Like, we're not going to get anything. And then you meet these entrepreneurs who are coming like starry-eyed and ready to like tackle the world. And, the optimism is not beaten out of them at this point. And it's very fun and infectious to kind of like be tackling problems with those people. I think being on the investing side has definitely taught me quite a bit. For one, just like how people think about fundraising as a process, I think it's so much more psychological than anything else, especially at the really early stage where you don't have a lot of data about how your business is doing. So there's so much more about like trying to understand teams and how they think about approaching problems and how they work with each other. How do they think about experimentation and knowing if the company is doing well or not? And then even things like, other investor psychology. So like what other funds are participating? Why did they say no? Like, what risks am I comfortable with as a person with this business? You're trying to answer all those questions, and it's actually way more psychological than it is. Like, I think a lot of people maybe who are not familiar investing think it's like, you're like in an Excel spreadsheet and you're like looking at the numbers and you're like, numbers look good. And it's like, that's really like a small part of it. A lot of the rest of it is just understanding if you're comfortable with the founders, do you want to work with them? And what you're really trying to ask is trying to figure out like what risks are existential to this business, and am I comfortable with the risks, and is that priced into this round properly? That's like the general gist. And so I guess I just like it's interesting to learn how much of this is more of a psychological thing than it is like a numbers game, basically.
That's interesting. I wouldn't have expected that. With actual founders, are there certain particular things you're looking for them psychologically in terms of their risk preferences? Or, I mean, I know that you mentioned the optimism of them, but what are the criteria you're actually evaluating people on?
Yeah. There's no one answer to this, right? So the thing that I think, people have to understand is different founder types will be right for different problem sets, right? So for example, let's say you're trying to start a business where you know that this business is going to need to raise a lot of money to like be successful. Maybe it's like building a full stack health insurance carrier from the ground up. Like, you know, that business is going to need a ton of money. Then you're going to actually need to have a founder who's an excellent salesperson and excellent at fundraising. That is just like a key quality that is going to be necessary for this business to exist. Let's say you have a company that is building like some labor marketplace that has to go state by state. This team has to have like a really, really in-depth understanding of how their unit economics work on a per state basis. And also they've basically have an idea of the experiments they want to run to like get this marketplace, this two-sided marketplace started from the ground up, because you got to go attract the supply side and the demand side, right? So each of these businesses actually requires a very different skill set and thing you're looking for in founders. So, you know, I mean, there's like a general, obviously like a general baseline you probably want, right? Is this person really like thinking about this problem from first principles? Do the two founders or three founders have very delineated swim lanes so that like there's not going to be like any weird crossing that happens as the company grows? What do other people who have worked with these founders previously say about them? Are they the kind of people that like are tackling whatever problem they see, or are they kind of like delegating stuff away to different people and like, you know, taking credit, sharing blame kind of thing? So I think there's like a baseline, but really there's a lot of like business specific qualities that I think you're looking for, depending on what they're trying to build.
So let's say that you have a resident or a physician or a medical student who come up with some idea or some solution for some problem that they identify, and they get together, you know, a couple of people to put together some version of an app that could solve this problem. Like where does it go from there after you have a problem, a makeshift solution of sorts, and they've thought about it, and what do they do at that point to get funding or to move to the next stage?
Yeah, I mean, it obviously depends on like how far in the development process you are, and also like what reason do you need to fundraise at this point, right? I generally, I mean, the thing I don't like right now with the health tech ecosystem broadly is I think people are just fundraising for the sake of fundraising, as opposed to fundraising because there's some specific need for which they need to fundraise. Like, people should understand that once you get on the venture like treadmill, you have a lot more obligations in terms of like how fast your company needs to grow, how how you think about customer acquisition, like a lot of this stuff that I don't think people realize before they raise money. So for a lot of people, I actually think that their company can exist without raising money, and might even be better if it's like not it doesn't have aspirations to be this massive business, right? So one is like, do you need to raise money at all? Second is, what do you want to get out of the investors that you're working with? So for some people, it's like, I just want money. Like, commodity money is fine for me. And they don't really care where the source of the money comes from. For other people, they're like, we really need help in XYZ area. We want like intros to customers of this specific profile. We think that like we are going to have a really hard time recruiting this like very scarce talent pool. I need someone who can help us with that. So knowing what you want from your investors, I think is really important. And then from there, you can kind of like pick a specific investor profile to also like, do we want investors that'll just be there for this round? Or do we want, and then, you know, we go out and kind of raise from different people after that? Or do we want investors who are like multi-stage funds where they can kind of invest now, but also invest through later rounds? Which the downside of that is if they don't invest in later rounds, then you have like weird signaling risk where other people are like, wait, why didn't that investor invest in the next round? So there's double-edged sword for this. But I think once you get your investor profile type you're like thinking of and are interested in, then you can either cold outreach. I think most investors are actually pretty open to cold outreach. Obviously, if you do have like a connection of some kind to the investor, like getting some sort of third-party verification in some capacity is always helpful, but not necessary. And then, you know, go through the pitch. The thing that, especially if you already have an app that kind of exists, a big part is trying to figure out like, what are the North Star metrics that you really care about as a business, right? So is it clinician usage, for example? Is it number of engaged patients? Is it whatever number of things built within the app itself? Obviously, just depends on what you're solving for. And then the big thing I'll say for physicians specifically is also, have they actually looked into whether stuff like this has existed beforehand? Because I have noticed that for a lot of physician pitches, it's like, I have this problem and I'm going to build something for it. And then not seeing that, like, yeah, stuff like this has been built quite a bit in the past. Like, they faced XYZ problems. Like, how are you thinking about those problems as you grow your business, right? And a lot of times, like, physician entrepreneurs just like don't think like about these external things. Are very like myopic, and that's like a superpower also in a lot of cases, but it's like very myopically focus on the problem that they face, where maybe it's just a problem you face at your hospital, right? Maybe it's not a problem that is faced by other physicians at their hospital. So I think just like some general market research validation outside of your own specific area, I think is important. So hopefully that's useful.
You wrote on Out of Pocket something called 6 Stages of Health Tech Grief. And in it, you make a number of arguments, including your statement that basically now is the best time to be getting into health tech. What is it exactly that fuels your optimism now for health tech entrepreneurs?
I think it's a few things. I think one, I think the appetite to invest in new healthcare solutions is just much higher, which is good in the sense of now I would say companies can take bigger swings in healthcare. So like maybe in the past, you had to build like a point solution that's sold to health insurers. But today, actually, there's enough funding appetite that you can like try and build a health insurance carrier from the ground up. So I think the funding environment has changed quite a bit. The second is a lot of new infrastructure tools have actually made it way easier to now build a healthcare company generally. So for example, if you wanted to start a new like care delivery organization in some capacity, you'd have to build your own credentialing and licensing engine in-house. But now there are APIs that basically you like send your stuff to them, they'll basically handle that for you and monitor it. Or you want to add pharmacy fulfillment to your workflow. You previously would have to like go out, contract with different mail order pharmacies, like monitor how they're doing, see if they're actually get it to patients in a reasonable time. Now you can just like plug it into an API and there's like a pharmacy fulfillment, like TruePill, for example, like runs their own network of pharmacies and they'll fulfill it for you, give you all the data back you need to know if it's happening. So because of that, the cost of actually spinning up a healthcare business and like prototyping new ideas and solutions has just dropped dramatically. And then the last thing I'll say is I just think that the existing brand names in healthcare, especially during COVID, have just like lost a lot of luster for everybody. I think patients like don't really feel as strong of kind of affinity as to any one brand in healthcare. I think, you tell me if this is true, but I think a lot of clinicians also are sort of, kind of not looking as starry-eyed at a lot of the name brand institutions and, want to work for them in the same way that I think in the past they've had a lot of affinity to. And so I just think that right now, there's like a lot of room to build new solutions. And also I think during COVID, a lot of the business models for existing healthcare companies really were sort of shown like how faulty they are. If you're in a largely fee-for-service environment and no one can come into the hospital, like suddenly your entire revenue stream for elective surgery is kind of, screwed. If you make most of your money off commercial health insurance and then people are losing their jobs left, right, and center, they don't have commercial health insurance anymore. Like they might be on Medicaid now. So I just think a lot of things got shook up during COVID that have sort of created basically like the perfect environment to kind of try out new things, essentially.
You brought up a lot of different points of how COVID has changed the healthcare environment. What are you most and least optimistic about moving forward as to how COVID has impacted healthcare?
Yeah. I think the thing I'm most optimistic about is I think that there is, again, like a lot of room for new players that are tech first to capture customer loyalty in a way that I think would have been really hard pre-COVID, because a lot of people were just actually kind of sort of forced to try new players and new workflows and, things like telemedicine, which maybe they never tried in the past. And I think a lot of the tooling for not only like patients to use, but also physicians to use has gotten a lot better during COVID. And I think in that scenario, things like telemedicine, remote patient monitoring, et cetera, I think will actually become a much more ingrained and expected part of care delivery going forward. So I'm actually very optimistic, even though like all these reports are like, oh, telemedicine is dead. Like, I don't think they know what the fuck they're talking about. And then I think the parts I'm less optimistic about, I think I was naively maybe more optimistic that like the federal response and changes would be a little bit more permanent post-COVID. And I'm a little worried that they're going to kind of backtrack at this point. Like I really thought, oh, we're going to see way more, way more like reviewing of Medicaid budgets, for example, and like really change a lot of how Medicaid contracting works. Like not totally sure that's going to happen. I also thought that like a lot of evidence-based medicine would actually change, because for the first time in the last 2 years, we have this natural experiment of rationing healthcare. And you might actually discover that like, oh, a lot of treatment guidelines are kind of overtreating patients. And now we find out that outcomes are actually just as good if you do less procedures for X disease. And I don't think that's going to happen, because a lot of people make a lot of money from people coming into the hospital, and there's not a lot of incentive for people to do research on rationing care. And I thought telemedicine like regulations would change quite a bit. Like I thought we'd have a national licensure by now. I thought that like everyone would be on board with like making a way easier telemedicine reimbursement process. No, not the case. So those are kind of the areas that I'm more and less optimistic on. Oh, also just one other thing. I think home diagnostics and home healthcare I'm like way more optimistic about that. So I think it's like one of the perfect areas where it's way more convenient for patients. And also you can build like new business models that are, very low capital expenditure because you're not in an office. That I actually think that's one of the areas that I think is really going to take off post-COVID.
Speaking of business models, what business models in healthcare startups are you most bullish on?
I have always really liked the cash pay ecosystem generally. And I think now for the first time, you're starting to see companies who have started in cash pay really try to figure out what it looks like to get insurance reimbursement for other stuff. So cash pay ecosystem has always been really interesting to me. I hate the employer channel. Like if a company is specifically trying to get most of their money through employers, like it's just not for me. I am like of the very strict ideology that like employment and health insurance should be decoupled and benefits should be portable. And that's really, and also that like employers are bad purchasers of healthcare, like just generally. They care about price and nothing else. One of my like personal investing theses is basically that we are shifting in healthcare from a sales-driven top-down motion where you're trying to get buy-in from C-suite and then they sort of force the tools onto like the people below them, into a product-led bottoms-up adoption curve. And so, the analogous example might be in sort of like tech land. You have all these chat apps like Slack, et cetera, where people actually just use it because it's really fun, easy, and then it gets enterprise adoption because people actually really like using the tool. In healthcare, no one likes using their tools. Like everyone hates their tools. And which is always like very funny to me because I'm like, wow, physicians are like a very high income category and hate all the tools they use. So insane to me that gap exists. So for me, it's like any company that's trying to do sort of like bottoms up freemium style business models where you're really trying to get people who actually love using the tools and products that you're using and offer freemium tiers, like that's an area that I'm super interested in. And just generally people trying to target not frontline, not kind of like C-suite, but trying to target like the frontline people who are actually doing stuff as like a target audience. Super interesting to me.
Going back to the course that you are currently developing on the healthcare industry, I'm curious, what inspired you to create the course, and who is the intended audience?
Yeah. So the inspiration is actually twofold. One is it's just really hard to get up to speed in healthcare. Like if you were to tell someone like, hey, if someone came up to you and they were like, hey, I'm like new to healthcare, trying to like understand like how the industry works at a high level, like what are the resources you should go to? Like, I don't have anything off the top of my head. And that's insane because like that is literally my job. So part of it is just like it doesn't exist, gap in the market kind of exists there broadly. And also even on the stuff that does exist, it's so boring. Like healthcare is already kind of boring as an industry to begin with, but like getting into like explanation stuff, like, oh my God, like all of that stuff out there is just so boring. So at the very least, I'm going to make this entertaining, even if it's wrong. Just kidding. So that's one part. And then the second part is actually that when I was at TrialSpark, we had a learning and development budget that we could spend to like whatever, get to just like learn about random shit. You guys might know this as like CME courses in healthcare land. We had our own version of this. And I was, about to leave and I had my budget and I was like, damn, like what should I spend this on? Like, it's kind of be a waste to like have this go to like just completely vanish. And so I signed up for an advanced Excel modeling bootcamp, financial modeling bootcamp. And I went to this course and it is literally me and like 15, 22-year-olds who have just graduated from college. And everyone's going around the room and they're like, my name is Chad. I work at Evercore. And it gets to me and I'm like, yeah, my name is Nikhil. I just thought this would be kind of fun. And the thing that I realized is that a lot of companies outsource this part of onboarding to a third party to instead of like building their own internal course themselves. And then I was like, actually, and most healthcare startups that I know, they build their own version of courses internally to get people up to speed. And they're like bad. Like they're not, because it's not their, it's a waste of time for people internally to like have to explain X, Y, and Z thing to every single new employee. So I was like, I think I could do this. So the initial target audience is people who are working at health tech startups. And that is mostly going to be targeting people who are new to healthcare or only know like their one specific slice of healthcare myopically and want to learn more about how the kind of broader ecosystem works. So the course kind of goes through who are the big players, like what is a health insurance carrier, like what products do they offer? What is a provider? Like what are the different types of providers? And then also, so it goes through health insurance providers, pharmacies, pharma med devices, and then also the interstitials that exist between them to better understand how they interact with each other. So like TPAs, clearinghouses, PBMs, all this stuff where it's like, how do these companies interact with each other and what are the third parties that exist in between them also to make this happen? And that is just generally to give you a lay of the land. So that it's not going to teach you you're not going to come out of this being like the expert in everything in healthcare, but at the very least, like you'll know what to Google when you need to Google it. And that's kind of like, I think the important heuristic.
That sounds really, really cool. I look forward to seeing it when it comes out.
I say it's going to come out every month for the last 6 months. Don't hold your breath.
I have a question about pharmaceuticals and the pharmaceutical industry, particularly with respect to advertising, which is something that you've written a little bit about. In one of your posts, you wrote that, quote, instead of trying to suddenly police physicians, we just need to fight personal financial incentive with personal financial incentive and make it more attractive for physicians to give cost-effective drugs versus the new hot thing that pharma sales rep is peddling. How do you think about, and what ideas do you have for changing the relationship between physician incentives and pharma such that doctors are actually trying to improve giving out cost-effective drugs rather than just that which will make somebody, unbeknownst to them in the healthcare industry, very wealthy?
Yeah, damn, I really should have had an answer to this when I wrote that post. No, I think it's a good question. I think at the end of the day, like almost all of these problems stem from generally physicians being a part of fee-for-service revenue streams for the most part, right? And also physicians being under hospitals and like have less sort of not only autonomy and I would say a lot of the decisions that they make on a day-to-day basis, and who like kind of more intertwined with the hospital's like financial obligations, but also because they have less like personal brand risk than the hospital does, because they're kind of under this like larger umbrella org. So I think the two things that I really focus on a lot or think about a lot is how do we get physicians to how do we make it easier for physicians to become independent again? Because then at the very least, there's actually a lot of like social capital at risk for doing bad things, right? And also, they then can choose which payment arrangements they want to be in. And so if you're in a value-based care arrangement where there's some outcomes tie and all that kind of stuff, for some patients, actually, it still might make sense for you to give a branded drug, right? Like you don't want the patient to have a poor outcome as a result, right? So, but you'll think a little harder about like, okay, like I have this dollars at risk for this patient. And now I like really have to think like, is this the most cost-effective treatment for that patient? Because if it's not, then I'm losing money personally in my business. If it is, then both the patient and I are theoretically much happier. The one thing I will say about this though is like, I don't think patients are brought into the loop enough about this. Like they don't think like patients don't know when they're in value-based care arrangements, right? So when your physician is like recommending stuff, there's a lot of like financial mechanics happening in the back end that kind of impact this decision, right? And I actually think we underestimate patients a little bit in the sense of if you kind of like laid out the options and you're like, here are the things that like, are that we think would help you. And like, there are different cost benefits to each one of them. Right now, first of all, most physicians don't even know how much anything costs in the first place. So forget that. But even beyond that, I think the most physicians, right or wrong, are taught to give the best care. It is always like the best care. Like that's what you're optimizing for. Whereas for the patient, actually, they're not always thinking about the best care. They're like, what is care that I can afford, right? Because if you're getting care and you're bankrupt and you're getting bankrupted as a result of it, and you're told later that like, actually, you could have had this option. It would have been like 85% as good, but 20% the cost. I actually think more patients than you think would take that choice, but they're not really given that choice for a lot of whole host of structural reasons too. But yeah, so I think it's really aligning the financial incentives, and then all this downstream stuff comes as a result of that. Like, I don't think pharmaceutical companies giving information to doctors is inherently a bad thing. Like, drugs are getting more complicated, and someone has to do this, right? So yes, are drug companies financially incentivized to tell you that their drugs work better? Of course. But at the same time, at the very least, they can make physicians aware of certain drugs and like how they work. So that if the physician who is now financially incentivized to give cost-effective care wants to sift through and make decisions based on that information, they can. But I think right now in like a fee-for-service environment where most hospitals or doctors are getting paid like average sales price plus 6%, you have an incentive right now to give higher priced drugs, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. So anyway, long rant, but I think there's some more to be done there.
Yeah. And then there's this other fact, which is that doctors get very comfortable prescribing the drugs that they used, especially during residency. And those are the drugs that they're comfortable with. And then new drugs, that maybe is good for a certain period of time, but, as 10 years, 20 years down the line, there are newer medications, and the physician not every physician, obviously, but some physicians tend to they stick with the drugs that they know how they work, and that's what they do.
Yeah, just to riff off that, like one of the things that I kind of hope actually happens more is slightly more, like I'm actually surprised at how little practice patterns of physicians are compared against other physicians. So if you're within a physician group, like you probably should know more about how physicians like you treat patients like this. And actually, we don't have a ton of, and there are some new companies coming out that I actually think are pretty interesting trying to do this kind of stuff. But let's say like you're a physician and you are sticking to the treatment protocol that you learned in residency and you keep doing that. But then the data is showing that like 90% of the other physicians have switched over to a new drug, and you're one of the last people to do so. For one, like patients should probably know that, right? Like, wow, like my doctor like practices like very different from other doctors. Why? Right? Maybe there's a reason for it. That's that's totally possible too. But patients have no idea about that. And most physicians actually don't even know that, right? Like sometimes they're just like on autopilot and doing their own thing and like not thinking about, like, the place you end up discovering a lot of this is like conferences, right? But I think that there's way more to be done, just like teaching physicians how more people like them treat patients like this that maybe would help their practice patterns.
What are your thoughts on the pharmaceutical industry advertising to physicians or having direct to patient advertising?
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't think direct to patient advertising is like as bad as most people do, probably. Like, I think for the most part, again, like most patients are not even making this decision themselves. So it's not really like it's not like a direct one-to-one relationship of like patient sees ad, patient buys drug, right? There's an intermediary in between for a reason that's supposed to like help them guide and make that decision. I think it's actually interesting, since I wrote that post, in telemedicine world now, a whole new sort of like crop of direct to consumer pharmacies, specifically targeting areas like ADHD and a lot of areas where the pitch and advertising is like, you are underdiagnosed with this condition, go see a doctor because you probably have it, and here's why. I think has actually changed a little bit my view on this, where, I think a lot of these companies use advertising to like medicalize conditions in a lot of ways that can be dangerous for a lot of people. But again, like even though like I think it's good that patients like get that information and like at least go talk to their doctor about it, whether or not it's like it doesn't comes from biased sources or not. But that's why I think the advertising to physicians is much more important to focus on, because at the end of the day, the physician is the person that's supposed to help the patient understand if it's good for them or not, like if it's the right thing for them. And so now when the physician has like a financial incentive here and the patient doesn't really know about it or doesn't understand how the physician is being kind of like sort of has financial ties or all that kind of stuff, then now the gatekeeping and like guidance mechanism is all warped, right? So I think just general advertising is broadly okay, but the way that advertising happens to physicians is not just like, let's put a banner ad somewhere. It's like, do you want to come consult for this company? And like a lot of like more financially intertwined things that are, I think, more insidious than that. And so that I think is like a not great part of this relationship. So I mean, I'm kind of in the camp of like, I go back and forth about this. I don't have like a strong opinion here, but it's either we let physicians take whatever they want, but then we are hyper transparent about all of this. And so like Sunshine Act lets you see how much physicians get from different sources, but really just like ramping that up on steroids. So like when you're a patient and you book something with a doctor, like you should be able to see like, yeah, this doctor gets a lot of money from like these specific pharmaceutical companies. You can choose to see them if you want, like it is what it is, but you should know that in advance. Or the opposite is just like, don't let any kind of like relationship at all between pharmaceutical companies and physicians and like keep them at arm's reach. But that I think also is bad for other reasons too, right? Like doctors should actually want to be part of things like research and all that kind of stuff. And that is financial, that is like inherently going to always be financially incentivized. So trade-offs between the two, don't have a great answer, but I think it's important to like think about it at least.
It was interesting reading your some of what you wrote on this topic, and the fact that advertising companies have switched from the direct sales pitch to using more of these medical science liaisons, so like scientists and physicians, in order to basically get more credibility among doctors. I know very few physicians who would be comfortable saying that they had a one-on-one meeting with a sales representative, who would be much more comfortable going to a lecture by somebody well regarded in the field who just happened to get a substantial amount of money for their research from somebody in industry. So it's a weird kind of like confluence of the person with the knowledge base is the person that's now getting funding from the industry. So that's a pretty complicated topic. I'm not exactly sure how best to resolve it.
Yeah, I mean, again, like I don't think there's any perfect systems, right? But I do think when people have individual reputation on the line amongst peers, I think they think long and hard about this way more than like one-on-one patient relationship where they're kind of just doing their prescribing in the shadows and like they don't have to think too much about like what their peers are going to think of them, because a lot of times their peers don't see this directly, right? But now let's say like your colleague who you went to med school with like 20 years ago and like hold in really high self-esteem really is talking about this drug that they, actually swear by. Like that person, if the drug is bad, you're going to think really poorly of them, right? So at the very least, they care about like respect, social capital, etc., in a way that like they're going to at least try and figure out like which drugs would I genuinely actually recommend to other people, right? So again, like I think we talk a lot about personal financial incentives, but there's this other part which is more like reputation, social capital incentives, which I actually think is almost more important in the field of medicine, specifically compared to maybe other industries, because things like prestige and kind of what comes along with that has long been a part of the industry. So this is just like another sort of facet of that, is like, how do you convert prestige and reputation into financial capital without like ruining your reputation and prestige? So yeah, I don't know.
Very interesting. Changing topics just slightly from pharmaceuticals to prescription digital therapeutics. What can you tell me about prescription digital therapeutics and the potential that you see in them?
Yeah, so for people who aren't super familiar with this, prescription digital therapeutics are basically, can you elicit some sort of response that's similar to what a drug would elicit as an intervention, but using software-based tools, basically. So an example is video games that are specifically targeted to kids with ADHD and helping with their different like attention deficit scores, for example, or companies providing CBT through software that helps with their PHQ-9s, GAD-7s, and like all that kind of stuff. So prescription digital therapeutics, yeah. So the problem is like, and I think there's a lot of promise here, right? Like I think a lot of the studies show like, yeah, like in a lot of especially low to moderate severity diseases, they're very helpful because finding drug effects there is actually quite hard. And generally, pharma has like strayed away from doing low to moderate severity in a lot of different disease areas because juice is just not worth the squeeze. Finding the effects in the trials is really hard, et cetera. And so it's been largely kind of overlooked from the traditional pharmaceutical industry. And I think it's a great place for something like a digital therapeutic. So the problem is that like most digital therapeutics don't know if they want to be drugs or if they want to be software. And so when you force digital therapeutics to prove the same amount of evidence as a drug, it is very expensive to bring a digital therapeutic to market. When it is very expensive to bring a digital therapeutic to market, you have to get reimbursed like a drug to recoup the R&D cost. And so the problem is that even though digital therapeutics are infinitely scalable, right? Like that's one of the fantastic parts. They're infinitely scalable and they're modifiable once they're actually in market. So like it's software. You can personalize this to like the end person. You can make changes as you see improvements based on real world usage. You can't do that with drugs, right? And so that is the promise here. But as long as we are like confined to the paradigm of prescription digital therapeutics need to like be the same exact thing as drugs, we'll never be able to take advantage of that. And so the problem is now all these digital therapeutics it's very difficult for them to actually like push updates and personalization tools post approval, and they have to charge like thousands of dollars, despite the fact that they actually could theoretically, because the cost of producing is so low, do this in a much more scalable way. And so that's basically what I think the pros and the cons of digital therapeutics are today. But I'm optimistic about them generally, and I think they'll, especially in certain areas that have like way higher mental behavioral health component to the disease itself be used way more regularly. So, even areas like GI and areas like, whatever, mental behavioral health or comorbidities that come with like certain areas like diabetes or chronic disease, all that kind of stuff that are maybe a little bit more underlying behavioral health conditions can actually be like be very useful in those areas.
So, two terms that one hears when researching health technology are interoperable and FIRE. Can you explain what those terms are and how they apply to healthcare?
Yeah. So interoperability, I think it's like one of these meme words that has now just been thrown around for like the last decade. But I think everyone can kind of empathize with the problem, which is that like data cannot be shared across different applications that you use today. Like if you ever go into a doctor's office and fill out the patient intake form for the 10th time and want to blow your brains out in the process, like one part of it is because data is not interoperable from all those other million times that you did it. And then FIRE is a data standard basically to get all the data kind of structured and map in a uniform way so that you can actually do things like port it from point A to point B, and both the institution/program that sends the information can then be received by a different program, and it understands exactly like how that data is supposed to look and be interpreted. People have been talking about this for a very long time, right? And I think everyone knows that at some point we will have a free-flowing data ecosystem within healthcare. There have been some developments here where, especially the Office of the ONC has been really pushing the standard. So, you can't have interoperability without a standard. So FIRE and another standard called USCDI, I think, have like become kind of the de facto standards that the government is sort of asking everyone to adhere to. But also beyond that, now we have rules around how much data you have to make interoperable. So this was fought tooth and nail by hospitals and EMR service providers. But now, over the next few years, a lot of these companies have to make a machine-readable format for different kind of data fields. So slowly, it'll be more and more over time. So things like imaging and a lot of that kind of stuff will come later. But right now, it's like a lot of the basic stuff like name, date of birth, address, and all the basic conditions, et cetera, that now if you're a patient, you can actually, or you soon should be able to like request your records and kind of give it to a third party that you give it to a third party that you authorize to do so. And so now data can actually like come out of your patient record or other areas and be given to like third parties that you sort of choose. So that is a awesome development and like much needed. But the reality is like hospitals don't want this, right? Like most health systems view data interoperability as a threat to patient leakage. If you can give your data to any third party, then you can take your data to wherever you want to go. And like, how many times do hospitals pitch like, oh, everything is in like one place and you can just go downstairs and get your labs done. It goes right into your record and it's like way easier for everyone. But that's not good, right? Like you should be able to choose whichever lab provider you want. There might be one that's way cheaper, but it's a pain in the ass to get your data from point A to point B in a lot of cases. I mean, when I was at TrialSpark, we need to get full patient records to enroll them in trials, obviously. And one part of that was images in certain types of trials. To get your image from an imaging center, you have to get it. They give it to you in the form of a CD-ROM. We literally did not have a CD-ROM drive in the office the first time this happened. We had to like buy an external dongle that basically could ingest a CD-ROM. Like, how insane that is? Just like in the 21st century that like you're like, I'm buying a CD-ROM drive off Amazon. Like, I feel like I'm like Neanderthal. Like, so the fact that like now we finally have data standards and kind of like forced formatting, I think is really important.
I hope you faxed your complaint to their company headquarters.
I think healthcare is like propping up the fax industry. Like straight up, I do not like who's making new faxes and why. And I think it's only because of healthcare.
You mentioned the office of the ONC. Forgive my total ignorance. What exactly is the office of the ONC and their exact involvement in the interoperability debate?
Oh man, you're gonna catch me at my not knowing all of the 3-letter acronyms off the back of my head. The ONC, I think, is Office of the National Coordinator, I want to say, but basically they're in charge of a lot of like the health IT stuff generally. So even things like when meaningful use and a lot of that kind of stuff came out where you had to have specific things or EMR could do, et cetera. I think they're the people who put those rules out, but don't quote me on this because like I have not looked deeply into like what falls under their purview, but they are right now at least in charge of a lot of the interoperability stuff.
You've written about unbundling the hospital. Can you explain what you mean by that? And what are some examples?
Yeah. So, I mean, hospitals in the last, like post Affordable Care Act, hospitals have gotten more and more consolidated generally, whether that's acquiring other smaller practices, other hospitals, or ancillary services like imaging centers, labs, et cetera. Hospitals are now this like, whatever monolith of everything in healthcare that you need in one place. The downside of that is that everything that goes into a hospital is like 1 billion times more expensive, right? And also that hospitals are trying to treat every patient segment, right? Whether regardless of your socioeconomic class or your specific social needs or your specific condition and things you might need for that, they're trying to treat everyone. And so when you're a hospital, like you are optimizing for what are things I'm going to invest in that can treat as many patients, specifically also lucrative patients, as possible. When I say unbundling the hospital, what I mean is that each patient actually needs different stuff generally. And what I need as a patient might be different than what you need as a patient, but yet we are both going to the same hospital and getting care that's like maybe like good enough for our condition, but not really like targeted and focused to our condition. So, for example, like let's say I really struggle with like sleep issues, right? I actually want to find like a service provider that like focuses on everything end to end, from like sleep monitoring to like helping me figure out and sort through like which sleep apnea therapies are right for me, to maybe focusing on some of the other like social conditions, like if I'm overweight and like need to lose weight and that's really the cause of it. Like it's a really targeted specific thing for my condition, for example. Whereas like a hospital is not like investing deeply in a lot of that. They're investing in like, once you come through the doors of the hospital, like this is what we're going to do for you. So in my head, it's like unbundling the hospital is sort of targeting specific, like when consumers go out and they know what they want, like how do you basically provide like a more full suite for them that hospitals don't provide today? And this happens in like, just to be clear, like this has been a normal thing in every industry. Like healthcare is actually one of the only ones that this has not happened to, right? Like you want to get increasingly specific, like, I don't know, like hair care products, like it gets as specific as possible for something like that. Like, consumer packaged good companies have been like unbundled to the death. Every Instagram ad you see is now a small company targeting a very specific, hyper specific segment. And me as a consumer, I'm like, damn, like I totally would buy that. And they offer like a lot of stuff, as follow-on products that like I also would like love as well. And they're targeting me very specifically as a consumer, versus like healthcare has not gone through this same unbundling. So yeah, that's just like one aspect of it.
I see you've pointed on a topic that my bald brother and myself
yeah, sorry. Maybe you guys can't empathize with the hair care product, but let's say it's like individual glasses providers.
There we go.
Cool.
So,
Yeah.
Nikhil, thank you so much for joining us on the External Medicine Podcast. Is there any topic that we didn't touch on that you wanted to bring up before we close?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially since there's a lot of like new, med school students, residents, physicians, et cetera, one thing that I don't have a strong view on, obviously, because I didn't go to med school, but something I do think about a lot is what does the future of like medical education look like in a lot of cases? Because I think what I've noticed is just this kind of gap in, kind of these new tech developments that have been happening and kind of physicians training in those areas. So even for like a very tangible example might be something like telemedicine, where telemedicine-based care looks very different than care in the hospital where you're having a telemedicine tack on, right? So doing things like understanding how to interpret data from remote patient monitoring tools to like knowing the right interventions and touch points and like when to use text versus video versus a phone call. These are all actually like a totally new paradigm for how care delivery is actually done. And how do we actually bridge that gap between what people are learning in med school today with a lot of how care is changing in the world today? I don't have a great answer for that, but that is something that I think is worth meriting a discussion. And if anyone listening to this podcast wants to jam on it, I'm very easily findable on the internet. And so hit me up.
Well, we look forward to not just your Healthcare 101 course, but when you answer those questions in a future course.
Yeah. Hey, here's me, not a doctor, but here's how I think medical education should be changed. Yeah, that'll go real well.
I think there probably is a lot of need for outside voices in medical education. And you're somebody clearly aware of things changing in the healthcare industry. And, my medical school, probably will have to delete this from the interview. There are definitely some lectures about topics that haven't changed for 5, 10, 15 years. So
yeah, it's time to make some changes. So but yeah, always down to chat about this stuff. But thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Appreciate chatting.
It was our pleasure. We're going to, of course, in the show notes, put out of pocket. It's outofpocket.health. Where else should people look you up if they want to learn more about you?
I'm generally being a menace on Twitter at Nikhil. And yeah, that's those are main places. I'm not going to tell you guys my Reddit username because that's like my one private bastion. But yeah, come hang out with me.
Thank you once again. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks so much, man. Have a good rest of your day.
If you'd like to support us, here are some ways you can help. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review, preferably a phenomenal review. Visit us at externalmedicinepodcast.com and tell your friends.